It's episode number 26 of The Rent Roll, your podcast on all things rental housing, apartments, SFR, BTR, investments, policy, development, operations, and the whole gamut. This episode is all about, or I should say mostly all about opportunity zones. Hot topic in Washington, D.C. right now. And one of the rare issues earning bipartisan support. Not enough of those issues right now, but opportunity zones are one of them, thankfully. And we have a brand new landmark study released just this last week, documenting for the very first time the impacts of the Opportunity Zone legislation that was passed back in 2017. Really amazing data and results, and also at a shockingly low cost to the federal government. So we're going to dive into that and all the data from that study. And we'll bring in to talk about it the Wizard of Oz. Oz as in OZ, Opportunity Zones, and that is Dallas-based Opportunity Zone apartment developer Barrett Linburg of Savoy Equity Partners. He got the nickname the Wizard of Oz through his leading voice on Twitter/X, where he has more than 60,000 followers and always talking about Opportunity Zones, and been an active voice recently in DC on this too, given his increasingly high profile on the topic. Also, we have fresh data on inflation with CPI release just recently, as well as new data from the census on population growth by metro area in 2024. So we'll cover the latest data there, as well as headlines of the week talking about rental housing issues, including rent control proposals making headway in Washington state and in Maryland. Before we dive into all that, I want to give a big shout out to our sponsors who make the Rent Roll possible. First, to JPI, one of the nation's biggest apartment developers, active in Texas and Southern California, and soon to be elsewhere. And also to Madera Residential, one of the leading operators of apartments in Texas. All right, so as always, we're going to start off with, here's a chart. So this is where we talk about, I share you a chart for those who see the videos, and if not, if you don't have the video, I'll talk you right through it. And so first thing I'm talking about is inflation. The latest consumer price index data came out last week. And, the headline was that inflation came in a little bit below expectations. There's a subheadline for us rental housing nerds that the CPI rent, so the rent portion of inflation has continued its rapid cool down. And what a lot of people don't realize is, rent inflation's been upward driver of headline total inflation for a while. We're getting back to normal. As of February, CPI rent inflation was within 36 basis points of pre-COVID norms, so about 4.1%, just a little bit above where we were in the 2016 to 2019 timeframe before COVID hit, and then briefly rent inflation dropped off, and then of course surged upward to close to 9%. So it's cool and fast. It's a lagged metric. I've talked about this a lot. I'm not going to regurgitate all here, but it's finally catching up to what we're seeing on the ground. Of course, new lease rents have been flat for apartments and slightly positive for SFR. But again, this is a lag metric, includes renewals, but also in-place rents as well. Important to note here, though, is that this slowdown in CPI rent inflation would have happened regardless of what the Fed did on rates. But the Fed rate hikes, combined with the anemic rent growth in especially higher supplied markets, has crushed the construction pipeline, which points to renewed rent growth by next year, at least for the more real-time measures of rent. And CPI's version of rent, I think, will continue to cool for a while. And by the way, the reason I mentioned that rent inflation from the CPI would have cooled down regardless of what the Fed did, that's because of apartment supply. Apartment supply is at 50-year highs, and it's really supply that's putting downward pressure on rents, especially apartments, but even in the SFR side with all of the build-to-rent SFR coming onto the market. I covered that recently in our episode on the SFR REITs and the highlights there about the impact of build-to-rent supply on SFR rent growth. Next topic, the census just last week also released its data on population growth in 23 and from in 2024. So 1 year growth from 23 to 24. And for those of you who can see this table, I've got the top 20 markets and metro areas for population growth, those that have at least 500,000 in population. And punchline here is it's a lot of Texas and a lot of Florida. In fact, if you look at markets of all size, even the smaller ones, the top 50 markets for population growth last year, almost half of them, 23 were in Texas or Florida. Just 2 of the 50 states representing more than half of all the top MSAs for population growth last year. Among those are 50,000 and up, the places that most of us have heard of. Lakeland, Florida leads the nation, 3.5% growth last year, amounting to close to 30,000 people. Provo, Utah at 3%. Then I'll briefly kind of run down this list. Some others in Florida, Port St. Lucie is number 3. Orlando is the biggest of the top market for the second straight year at least. Fastest growing large market, up 2.7%, 76,000 people. Then we got Houston, Huntsville, Raleigh, Dallas, Austin, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Miami, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Boise, Charleston, Daytona Beach, Sarasota, Fort Myers, Las Vegas, and Fort Worth, all in the top 20. And all of those are between 1.9 to 2.9% growth in population last year. Now, when you look at population growth, it's a combination of international immigration plus domestic migration plus births minus deaths. Okay. And so let's focus just for a moment on domestic net migration. These are people who move from one metro area to another. So we're taking out the immigration and the birth factor. And by this measure, we see mostly the larger markets that dominate the list of where people are going. Dallas-Fort Worth, number 1, nearly 25,000 people moving into DFW last year. Charlotte jumped over Houston, taking the number 2 spot, actually over 24,000 people moving to Charlotte. So despite being significantly smaller than DFW, Charlotte came in within 200 people of just below DFW for growth. Houston, number 3 at 21.4, Phoenix, 21.3, Jacksonville, just under 20,000. Those are your top 5. Lakeland, Florida, so between Tampa and Orlando, that took the number 6 spot at 19,745 people moving into Lakeland, Winter Haven area from other parts of the country. Round out the 20, let's go through the rest of these. These are all 10 to call it 18, 19,000. San Antonio, Raleigh, Ocala, Florida, more central Florida. And that was also number 1 in the country for population growth among smaller markets in terms of population growth rate. More Florida, we have Sarasota, Daytona Beach at 10 and 11, and then Nashville, Myrtle Beach, Austin, Port St. Lucie, Las Vegas, Wilmington, North Carolina, Greenville, South Carolina, Palm Bay, Florida, and Charleston, South Carolina. I've been talking about Charleston a lot lately as well. It's making a lot of lists. And another one to look at as we think about population growth, a lot of markets right now are dependent on immigration from outside the U.S. for population growth. And so with all the conversation about immigration right now, and I talked about this a little bit with actually quite a bit on our episode on demographics a month or 2 ago with Chris Porter, is when you think about the potential impacts of changes to immigration policy, that is going to impact some places more than others. And so I think it's important it's not that all immigration is going to go away, but if we do see a significant reduction in immigration, it's going to impact some places more than others. And kind of the armchair quarterback analysis has been, hey, it's going to impact the Sun Belt more because it's closer to the Mexican border. But it's not that simple. So I got a chart here for those who can see it. It shows a comparison of domestic migration plus births minus deaths compared to international immigration and what's driving the growth. And so if you look at what's above this line will be places that have positive domestic migration plus births minus deaths. So again, not reliant as reliant on international immigration for growth. And then below this line will be places that are seeing that would have seen population declines absent international immigration. And so again, when you take out international immigration, the growth markets are places you'd expect. Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, by far and away, they're the only markets above 40,000. In fact, they're close to 75, 80,000. And then you get Charlotte, Phoenix, San Antonio, Nashville, Austin, Atlanta, Raleigh, Jacksonville, Riverside, California. So you get some California in there. Las Vegas, Lakeland, Provo, Minneapolis, Charleston, Tampa, Orlando, Washington, D.C., and Seattle barely makes a list. A bunch of others, but just highlighting some of the growth markets. Seattle and D.C. are closer to the bottom of that list, but just highlighting some big markets. But mostly the places that are 20,000 and up are the Sun Belt, as well as Riverside, California, which obviously is a bit of an affordability magnet for those in Southern California. The places that would have seen population declines absent all immigration, which again, we're not going to see all immigration go away. But again, if we just, for argument's sake, take that piece out, New York would have been negative 80,000. Los Angeles and Miami would have been somewhere between 80 and 90,000 in lost population. And Miami, this is by the way, the whole South Florida area, not just Miami-Dade County. So those are the ones that would be most impacted by this, the ones that are most reliant on international immigration for their population growth to offset domestic migration losses, especially New York and Los Angeles by that measure. Also, that would be negative absent immigration would be Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, San Jose, Detroit, San Diego, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Those are some of a handful of markets that would jump out on this list. So it would, in a most dramatic scenario, impact larger coastal markets more than the Sunbelt market, just because the Sunbelt markets continue to grow through domestic migration as well as natural growth of births minus deaths. So there you have it. There's our latest on population growth. Now let's jump into today's topic of focus, opportunity zones. And so I teased this out earlier. We have a brand new study, a landmark study, really interesting one, produced last week by the Economic Innovation Group. And particularly give a shout out to the authors, Ben Glasner, Adam Ozimek, and John Lettieri. Hope I said his name right. And a really great report. Very interesting. For those who haven't had a chance to read it, I recommend it. But I'm going to highlight some of the key takeaways here. First chart I'm going to show you, if those can see my screen. If not, again, I'll talk you through it. Is it's the money chart. It shows net new housing created in opportunity zones prior and after the legislation went into effect. Prior to this legislation, which again was passed in 2017, and then the opportunity zones were certified in 2018, the neighborhoods that became opportunity zones had been, in the words of the authors, left behind. Economically challenged areas seeing no housing supply growth for a decade. Since then, we've completed 313,000 new housing units across opportunity zones nationally, and with still more under construction that aren't yet tallied in these numbers, that number is going to keep going up. And it's really a remarkable ascent. Again, I know most of you just listening don't see the screen, but this chart is fantastic. I posted it on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. It shows these flat numbers from 2013 to 2020, and then this rocket ship upward from 2021 to 2024. And then the OZ tracks, by the way, they got certified, I mentioned, in 2018. And so it makes sense. We didn't really see the impact in terms of completions and units being leased and addresses created until 2021, since it takes time to acquire the land, go through permitting and entitlement, then get these projects built and leased. So remarkable growth, 313,000 new addresses created in opportunity zones. And what's also maybe even more remarkable, first of all, you'd want to see that an incentive, a tax incentive, would encourage development. But not only is it doing that, but we're now actually seeing opportunity zones outpacing the national average in creating new housing supply. So this chart showing that in 2024, we saw 1.8% growth in residential addresses or units for opportunity zones versus 1.5% growth in non-opportunity zone tracts in 2024. Prior to OZ being put in place, these neighborhoods that became known as opportunity zones routinely trailed non-opportunity zones for supply. So while we built more everywhere in this cycle, the outsized growth in opportunity zones is undoubtedly traced back to the OZ incentives. And to have 30 bips more growth in opportunity zones versus non-OZs is, to me, that's a crazy stat, because, these are, as Adam Ozimek said, one of the authors, he said, these are genuinely distressed communities. And he added some really good myth busting here, added that some of the reporting on opportunity zones suggesting otherwise, that they're not economically distressed areas, in his words, has centered around an unrepresentative handful of outlier anecdotes. And I'll talk about this more a little bit later, but lots of bad myths out there being reported by cynics who are just not informed of the facts or who are falsely positioning isolated anecdotes as representative of a broader trend. All right, next thing. Opportunity zones account for 48% of new housing in these designated tracts, 16% across all low-income communities. So 16% of all new housing across low-income communities is driven by opportunity zone construction. And then also it's responsible for 4% of all new housing nationally. One of the report's authors wrote that these are astonishingly large results, and they're impacting not only urban areas, but also suburban and rural and in between. This chart shows the number of housing units built by type of geography per census tract. Highest impact is mid-sized urban areas and large urban areas with 50 to 59 units per census tract. But small urban and suburban aren't far behind at 33 and 38 units per tract, respectively. And here's the real kicker. I teased this earlier. It costs the federal government just $26,000 per unit in federal spending to get housing built in opportunity zones. Co-author Benjamin Glasner noted that opportunity zones are, quote, vastly cheaper than traditional subsidies for taxpayers. And he said that the results underscore that flexible, market-driven tax incentives can mobilize private capital, unlocking significant investment potential in distressed communities. So bottom line, why are opportunity zones so effective and so efficient? Well, I'll give you a couple thoughts, and then I'm going to dive into this more with Barrett Linburg later. But first, unlike other programs, opportunity zones have a what's called a by right qualification. That means there's no bureaucratic approvals necessary. There's no application process that can get saddled with red tape and burdensome requests and all the other stuff. Like, it's a federal tax benefit that doesn't require that cities have to do anything special other than issue the standard permits to build, and nor does it require any kind of special connections to people in the right office to access these things. So it turns out, not surprisingly, that simpler is better and faster for getting housing built. Ben Glasner also wrote that opportunity zones, quote, may be the most effective pro-housing supply policy in America today, which is pretty strong take. Here's my take on all this. Opportunity zones are proven to work, so let's double down on what actually works. And fundamentally, we should be incentivizing the creation of things that we need more of as a society, and we do need more housing. So let's lean heavily on programs that actually work, and opportunity zones clearly work well. And it's been really encouraging to see that HUD Secretary Scott Turner, along with policymakers on both sides of the aisle, want to expand and extend opportunity zones. The current legislation expires in 2026. But there's a lot of appetite to extend and expand them. I talked to Barrett about that as well, since he's been talking to some of the policymakers about this topic. And perhaps even expanding this to include for sale housing in addition to rental apartments. Today, it does not include for sale homes built by home builders, but there is a way to, there's a path to make that happen. So I'll talk to Barrett about that. All right, next up, rental housing trivia. So today's question goes back to opportunity zones, and the question for this week is, who determined which census tracts to designate as opportunity zones when the program was created? Was it A, the administration / HUD? Was it B, Congress? Or C, governors of each state? So take a moment to think about that, and I'll give you the answer in a little bit. But next up, in the news. All right, a few headlines on rental housing this week. First one is an investor survey from Berkadia. A couple interesting results, not really shocking, but I'll highlight the takeaways. A couple things. First of all, it shows that multifamily investors want to be net buyers this year. 65% said they plan to moderately expand their multifamily portfolios. 18% say they want to aggressively expand their multifamily portfolios. Now, I've talked about this previously. I think obviously everybody wants to do it. We'll see how attainable that is given the lack of inventory on the market to acquire, especially at attractive prices. But you can see there's a lot of appetite to buy multifamily. Second takeaway is that the Berkadia asked, from your perspective, which three geographic regions do you believe will be the best for multifamily investments in 2025? The top three results were Southeast, Midwest, and Texas. And below that was Southwest and Mountain, Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, both kind of tied for fourth. And much lower on the list was West, Pacific Northwest, and Central, which I assume would be like, I'm not sure how that's defined, but I'm guessing Central, if it's not Texas or the Midwest, maybe like Chicago area. I'm not sure exactly how it's defined. So, by the way, best investments for 2025 does not mean best rent growth. I mean, you could see, some of these coastal markets do better in rent growth in 2025, but what it's talking about is best risk-adjusted returns over the anticipated lifespan of the investment. And by that measure, you can see Sunbelt and Midwest, as I've talked about quite a bit, are definitely in favor among investors of all types. Next headline comes from the Washington State Standard, and the headline is Rent Increase Cap Approved by Washington House. The bill would limit annual price hikes for residential tenants to no more than 7% a year. It next goes to the state Senate. I'll read a little more from the article. It says the House Bill 2012-17 would prohibit landlords from raising a resident's rent and fees more than 7% in a 12-month period. And then it says that it would also require landlords give 90 days notice before any rent increase takes effect and would bar them from charging more than a 5% difference in rent for similar leased units. There are several exceptions to the cap, including buildings operated by nonprofits and residential construction that is 12 years old or less. Rent increase limits would not apply for tenants of triplexes and fourplexes if the owner lives in one of the units. All right, so here's the thing. It's not that 7% is too low, okay? Yeah, and I tell people this all the time. It's not, everybody gets attached to the number. And they say, the 7% is very reasonable. Well, it's not the number. It's the signal. It's the signal to the market. It's a signal that we're going to legislate for the outliers, that we think that landlords, quote, quote, landlords are the problem, not part of the solution. It's not the housing shortage. It's greedy landlords. And the problem is that signal is not only that we're going to demonize housing providers, which is, immediately going to be a tough place to do business. If it's not rent control, it's going to be other things. You're going to be pushed in the way of operating those markets. It's also the slippery slope. I've talked about this before, but New York has had versions of rent control going back 100 plus years. And it's still, of course, a very unaffordable market for anybody moving into the area. And it's done what's called, quote, quote, recapture, which is the 4 times, okay, 4+ times, at least 4 times. Recapture is when we remove exemptions on properties previously exempt from rent control or rent stabilization or good cause eviction, which are all different names for the same thing. And so why would you invest? The investors are being asked to make bets that are tens of millions of dollars, if not more, for an apartment, okay? So asking to invest in a market, that type of capital, and gamble tens of millions of dollars, you're and hoping that the state keeps its word, that's not going to tighten the rent cap or add properties previously exempt. Again, you're asking investors to gamble tens of millions of dollars, if not more, on political stability, and that's a tough bet. And furthermore, what if inflation reaccelerates above 7%? This isn't 7% plus CPI; it's 7%, and the bill does nothing to cap operating expenses, of course. Great quote from Representative April Connors of Kennewick in this article, and she's right on. She said, renters are frustrated. Those concerns are absolutely real, but rent control is not the answer. This bill will not stabilize the market. It's going to choke off housing supply. Economists all agree this is not a housing solution. It is a self-inflicted economic wound. So it's well said. So again, even though new supply is exempt, you're taking them at their word that that's not going to change in future election cycles during the lifespan of your investment. Next headline comes from Maryland Matters. This is part of the state's newsroom. It's part of the same family of media outlets. And the headline is Good Cause at a Cost. Counties may have to pick either good cause evictions or rent stabilizations. Advocates say both policies protect renters, but Senate leadership worry the regulations will drive away housing developers. And, I read this headline and guys, it's 2 different versions of the same thing. Good cause versus rent stabilization. They're just 2 different versions of the same thing. And yes, it will limit development and investment. Just take time to look at the cities and counties that already did it. Look at even in your own state, in Montgomery County. It's all of a sudden been redlined by a lot of investors because of the rent control already passed there. So take time to review the academic research, then build more housing, create funded safety nets instead of unfunded mandates. And by the way, I've mentioned this before, but if anyone's interested in a simple explanation of why academic economists and who are completely unaffiliated with the industry, why they hate rent control and see it as counterproductive to the cause of housing affordability, there's a great episode of the Freakonomics podcast on this. Just Google Freakonomics and rent control, and you should find it. Cites lots of great research on why rent control backfires and the very people it's intended to protect. Next headline comes from Bloomberg. A $60 billion investment fund manager is raising funds to buy affordable rental homes. This is from Patrick Clark at Bloomberg News. He wrote that Pretium, a U.S. investment manager overseeing nearly $60 billion of assets, is raising its first fund dedicated to acquiring single-family homes that can be leased at affordable rents, according to people familiar with the effort. The strategy involves doing deep renovations to improve the properties and renting them through the government's Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. And the move is partly driven by the dynamics in the debt market, where borrowing costs remain elevated compared to the recent past. Pretium sees an opportunity to acquire properties at prices that deliver better yields than what it can earn at higher price points. So very interesting. See, moving down market. This can be a tough space dealing with public housing authorities and Section 8, but it's encouraging to see institutional focus on the more affordable levels of the SFR market and to see them investing in renovations and putting in the resources and knowledge to operate well and with quality. All right. Next up, complaints department. All right, I've not done the complaints department segment in a while, but this is when I deal with a complaint or a cynical comment I get over social media. So always a little bit of fun. And so when I posted on the EIG study related to opportunity zones this past week, I got some cynical comments. And this one said on Twitter/X, it said, I wrote, "Hey, let's double down on what actually works, build more housing through opportunity zones." And someone wrote back, "And never pay taxes. Nice scam deal with opportunity zones. They go by census tract, I think, and that includes some very nice areas. Think universities." All right. So from the EIG study, let's myth bust this. We hear this all the time, not just this crazy guy on Twitter. We even see this reported in mainstream headlines. Here's from the EIG study. Here's what they said. Designated communities had an average poverty rate of 29% and a median family income 40% lower than the national median, while more than 97% of OZ tracts met the low-income community definition. Over 70% of the zones qualified for a more stringent, quote, severely distressed classification, according to the U.S. Treasury Department's Community Development Financial Institution Fund. So there you go. Myth busted. Next up, new digs. So new digs when I highlight a construction project, a recent construction project that's of interest or particularly interesting. And I want to highlight this one from this week's guest, Barrett Linburg and his firm, Savoy Equity Partners. This is Burnett Lofts, just south of downtown Dallas in North Oak Cliff. For those who can see the screen, and you can see this great view of downtown Dallas skyline, close proximity to I-35. And it's 86 units in an opportunity zone. So I'm going to talk to Barrett about his projects and what he builds, his demographics in a bit here. But what you'll typically see, and he'll talk about, I'm sure, is that it's not crazy finish out competing with the amenity war battles of the uptown Dallases of the world, but it's still attractive, well-located product with simpler but in-demand modern amenities like a fitness center, outdoor grills, package lockers, allowing them to lease at lower rent than you'd typically see for new construction around the urban core. All right, let's return to rental housing trivia. Again, our question for the week was, who determined which census tracts to designate as opportunity zones when the program was created? Was it A, the administration/HUD, B, the U.S. Congress, or C, state governors? And it was the states. It was the governors who get to determine within certain criteria which qualified as opportunity zones. So it really was determined, hopefully among those who know these cities. And that takes us to the interview portion of today's podcast. Again, our guest today is Barrett Linburg, the Wizard of Oz. Oz is in OZ, opportunity zones. He's the guru, and he's actively building in opportunity zones across Texas. All right, now we enter the interview portion of today's podcast, and I am thrilled to be joined by my friend Barrett Linburg from Savoy. So welcome, first of all, and second of all, tell us a little bit about your company.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jay. So my company, Savoy Equity Partners, my business partner is a guy named Seth Boehm. We've both been in the real estate business for 20 years. I started as a mortgage broker. He started investment sales. We both started buying real estate in Dallas, apartment buildings in 2012. I started with a little 8-unit building. He started with a 24-unit building. East Dallas, Oak Lawn, the old beat up buildings that you would see on your drive home. The building you'd see and say, why didn't somebody buy that and fix it up? Well, we would buy it and fix it up. So we do our own management. We would do our own construction and fix that up and then usually sell it, sometimes hold it. But now we've done about 30 of those projects and sold them. And really built a business around doing that. And then about 5 years ago, when cap rates all got about the same for A-class and C-class deals, we said, man, I think we should be developing as well. And so we started doing that. And so now we, in addition to having sold 30 deals, we now own about 30 deals as well. Almost everything we've done is in Dallas, but a couple in other Texas markets. And additionally, in the last 5 years, in addition to building, we've also capitalized everything in the opportunity zone tax structure. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So you become known as the Oz guy, the Wizard of Oz, and 60,000 plus followers on X/Twitter now, and really developed that as your expertise. You're the guy that everybody knows as the expert on the apartment world for opportunity zones. So I guess first and foremost, the opportunity zones came about and was 2017 tax bill, and then so tell us, how did you get involved with opportunity zones?
Sure. Like a lot of things in my career, it was kind of an accident, right? Stumbled into it. So have learned a lot of weird stuff over my career. So whether that's historic tax credits or the PFC tax structure that's unique to Texas, or 45L tax credits, we just stumble into it because it was naturally a fit for what we were already doing. So, as I just mentioned, we would go in and renovate old buildings that were in certain parts of town that seemed like a fit for us. Well, this one area of town that we really liked in North Oak Cliff area of Dallas, it was kind of blighted. There was a lot of vacant buildings. There was some crime in there, but we felt like, hey, if we buy enough buildings in this area, we could really make a difference. We could improve rents. We could make it a clean, safe place to live, all those things. And it also happened to have been designated an opportunity zone. And so my attorney happened to understand opportunity zones. Our accountant happened to understand opportunity zones. And so we learned opportunity zones.
That's great.
The nice thing is it was also a fit for all of our investors. It was 2020. People were making capital gains left and right.
Yeah.
And so we educated our investor base on what that meant. So what it meant for them is if they had a capital gain, they could invest with us. They could defer paying tax on that gain. And if we held that real estate investment for 10 plus years, then they wouldn't end up paying capital gains tax on the new investment with us, and they wouldn't have to recapture the depreciation. So it was a win for the area we were investing in, and it was a win for our investors because they got a better tax adjusted return.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think most people in the industry are more from, equity and debt side and operations are more familiar with the merchant build model, the traditional merchant build model, which is a shorter term hold. So just educate us a little bit. How does the opportunity zone model, which I believe is a 10-year hold requirement, how does that differ from the traditional merchant build model? And what are the implications for LP investors as well? Because it seems to me that what I like about this program is it actually brings in a type of investor who would not otherwise be investing in apartment construction, because traditionally it is more of a short-term hold.
Yeah. So when this was created, the government wanted to incentivize something specific. So this is called a place-based incentive, place-based tax incentive. So the government designated these areas all over the country, low-income census tracts. So the federal government created the incentive. Then each state's governor created the census tracts that were designated opportunity zone. And that incentivizes this long-term patient investment in these areas. And to get it, you have to own the real estate for 10 plus years. So that's number one. So your question, why is it not for merchant builders? Well, because you have to hold the investment for 10 plus years.
Yeah.
So from the developer's perspective, well, you got to hold it for 10 plus years. So you really need to have the skill set of asset manager, maybe property manager. You need to be more vertically integrated, or at least have the itch to asset manage it for 10 plus years. And then from the capital side, you need to have the patience to hold for 10 plus years. So I guess that answers your question.
Yeah. I imagine just because so many LP investors are used to the merchant build model, you're going to have some who are and are not comfortable with that model, and some probably bringing in new people investing in housing. So I guess my point is I see it as kind of additive to housing, because you're not having a lot of investors who are, going to do one or going to do both, right?
That's right. Well, and I think the legislation wisely incentivizes this longer term hold. And you look at, well, what is the developer, knowing they must hold a property for 10 years? What does the developer do differently? Well, they probably use materials that they're comfortable owning for 10 years. Are they more thoughtful about HVAC and plumbing and windows and flooring and all those things, which has the second order effect of being a better building for the tenant?
Yeah.
Right. So all those things play forward. Not saying that merchant builders are building crummy properties, but they're not worried about what that building looks like 5, 7, 10 years down the road, whereas an opportunity zone developer is.
Well, and then also, you mentioned these are low-income areas. Typically, think about low-income, think about LIHTC. Or in Texas, we have programs like PFC and HFC. What I like about the opportunity zones is it's by right. So it's not an application process, can be drawn out from, with years of red tape and, all the layered on requirements that cities like to do, or even just have a city that just doesn't like, that program for whatever reason. So from a developer and investor's perspective, talk to us about why by right is a big deal. And I assume it's got to be a significant savings in time and therefore cost.
Yeah, time and cost are huge. So Opportunity Zone is interesting because as far as federal programs go, there is so little friction to setting up an Opportunity Zone fund, what's called a Qualified Opportunity Zone business. It's very easy for us as a several-man shop to go capitalize a deal in the Opportunity Zone tax structure. We just have to set up an entity, an LLC for us in a specific way, file a specific type of tax return. But overall, that's several $1,000s more expensive versus LIHTC, where if you want to be a LIHTC developer, you really have to set up your firm to be a LIHTC developer.
Yeah.
Maybe dozens of people focus solely on that, and each project is going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars more to do it in that structure. So a little bit of friction versus a lot of friction.
No one's ever accused LIHTC of being low friction. So,
no. And the other really nice thing about Opportunity Zone is it can be paired with LIHTC.
Yeah.
It can be paired with PFC or HFC. All those things, and Live Local in Florida and various other tax abatement programs in North Carolina, South Carolina, everywhere else in the country. So the nice thing about OZ is it can stand alone and work just in a vacuum for a single market rate deal or even an industrial deal or a hotel or anything else. So it's not asset type specific, but it can also be paired with LIHTC or HFC or PFC. So if someone is focused on a very specialized product type, well, they can also utilize the OZ incentive. So it really does incentivize all types of housing.
Absolutely. Or at least rental housing for now, right?
Yeah.
We'll get into maybe others down the road here. Earlier in this podcast, I talked about highlights from the Economic Innovation Group report that just came out last week, and the bottom line showing remarkable impact in housing production, more than 300,000 units being produced in opportunity zones. When you read that report, what stood out to you? What were the biggest takeaways that you're going to be repeating over and over to policymakers and to investors?
Yeah, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Ben Glassner at EIG, who I got to sit next to last week at a conference, who really did an amazing job for a big reason. That big reason, and you know this as an economist, is that the original OZ legislation did not have a mechanism for data reporting. So U.S. Treasury has all this data and it doesn't have to release it to IRS, to Congress, to you and I. And so he has a really difficult job. You as an economist have a really difficult job because you have to figure out this data without having the data.
Yeah.
And so Ben went in and looked at the Postal Service data and said, hey, how many new addresses have been created in these census tracts over the last 5 years, over the last 7 years since OZ was formed? And let's back into it from there. And I thought that was really creative.
Very novel.
And so because of that, he's been able to figure out, well, let's take 2 OZ census tracts that are comparable in demographics or were comparable in demographics in 2017, one that was designated as OZ, one that wasn't, and then go from there. And what he was able to figure out based on that is that 300,000 new housing units have come online because of OZ. They wouldn't have happened but for the program. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
He also backed into the data and figured out this program costs about $26,000 per unit to the federal government.
Which is crazy.
Comparing that to LIHTC or other place-based incentives that have been utilized in the past, it's like 3, 4, 5 times more efficient in a Doge era, let's use the efficiency term, than other programs. So that's a huge deal. And then the last one that I think is really interesting is that it has done so without displacing a lot of people. So the people who have been there, their cost of housing for them hasn't gone up a whole bunch, and it's created more jobs in these areas, which were truly low income areas.
Yeah.
So I think all of those things are those are the things we're repeating to Congress members as we talk about OZ 2.0.
Yeah, and I want to get to OZ 2.0, but first, you mentioned low-income areas. Gets me thinking about, one of the things I liked about this report is the myth busting that it does. Because one of the things I see a lot on Twitter, and I think you do a great job combating it, is these myths that it's, hey, this is just, these are not low income areas. They're nice neighborhoods. It's class A plus apartments. The stuff would get built anyway. It's their developer handouts they don't need. And the report really shows that these really are low income areas. And I think a lot of outsiders don't understand that when you build in low income areas, you can't just build the traditional A plus ultra high amenitized product in most cases like you would in, we're here in Dallas, like in uptown Dallas or a Frisco. You have to build to the target demographic, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's probably more of a B plus type product and rent levels. So why is it difficult to, just for those who don't really understand how this works, like talk about why it's difficult to do that in these neighborhoods without those benefits, and how does the OZ structure make development possible in areas that wouldn't otherwise be possible?
Yeah, so and I'll get to product type in a minute, but before that, combating the developer handout thing, I want to stress something that I do whenever I talk to a reporter or somebody who says, well, OZ is a developer handout. Go back to the way that the legislation is written. This is incentivizing long-term patient investment. This isn't a handout to an investor or a developer because you're putting private capital at risk for 10 plus years in order to get the benefit of the incentive.
Yeah.
So people are investing millions, tens of millions of dollars in hopes of getting the incentive 10 years down the road. And what we've already seen is that some people who invested in high risk projects at the height of the market are losing money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? People who invested in risky development deals in 21, 22, they have not turned out well. And it turns out not only are they not going to get any OZ tax benefit, but they lost their money. Not good. Right? So it was the opposite of a developer handout. It worked out the other way. This is at-risk capital. And people are taking real risks with their money in these low-income census tracts. So I want to point that out very strongly. Because reporters, some very high profile articles like to point out and cherry pick specific projects which they don't like, but this is at-risk capital at work. So that's number one. But now let's get to your
Yeah,
question.
no one ever wants to talk about the downside risk. It's always just,
That's right.
oh, here's a pot of gold.
That's right. And it may be a pot of gold. It may be a wonderful pot of gold, but it's after 10 years of, a few years of development risk, lease up risk, and then 10 years of market risk holding these projects. So that's number one.
Yeah, and just one other point on that too is what I think a lot of people don't understand the outside world is like if you think returns should be capped at inflation, then no one's going to invest in housing construction. They're just going to go invest in bonds or something else that's easier to do. So there's got to be an incentive.
That's right.
All right, sorry, I derailed this.
So development. So what do you develop? Well, it's something that we as developers and many other developers all over the country try to figure out, right? If you're developing rural, suburban, urban, what is the right product for the right area? Can you build, a Ritz-Carlton in this area? Can you build a very amenitized Class A luxury property in this area? Or do you need something different? And it really, you have to think through who's your tenant going to be? What are they going to be willing to pay? What are their needs? Is it a family? Is it singles? Is it a young couple? Who's going to live there? And certainly some of these OZ census tracts have come further than others. So some might be ready for a more luxurious, higher rent property, but many of them have not. They're still on the upswing. And so they need something different. You kind of said a Class B plus. What does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
What we have found that it means in some of our areas, and that's in Dallas, so in North Oak Cliff, in the Cedars neighborhood, is that we're doing a surface parked, has an elevator, has a few amenities. So a grill space, a dog park, maybe a small fitness center or co-working lounge, but it doesn't have a swimming pool maybe. It doesn't have a wine storage area. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but we put in what we can. What it does have is a really nice unit interior, right? So the unit, if I just sat you down in the unit itself, it'll feel like anything else. But it doesn't have all the bells and whistles of something in uptown Dallas.
Right.
So we're able to save money on the total cost of the building and pass that savings on to the tenant by charging a lower rent. And so is that B plus or is it A minus? I don't know. I always have trouble,
I guess it's more the rent level. You're building at a B plus level rent as opposed to the A plus rent. But again, absent those incentives, can you build to those levels in those areas at profitably? Yeah.
And again, the incentive doesn't come to our investor on the front end, right? So it's really, our goal is to build a successful project that will be successful for the next decade. And so we have to think through that and say, is our unlevered yield on cost good? Mm-hmm. Are we going to be able to refinance in 2, 3, 4 years? And are we going to be able to hold this thing for the next decade and then sell it for a good profit?
Yeah.
That's what we're thinking through.
Yeah. So I guess, let me ask this in a different way though. It's like, I think just to combat the criticism that these get built even without the incentives, when you're raising capital, I imagine the OZ benefits are a big part of why we're seeing LPs willing to, developers will build wherever we can build, right? But getting LPs behind it, like that's got to be a big reason for this construction boom.
Correct. And so a big part of it for us is saying, are our investors willing to accept a slightly lower unlevered yield on cost or slightly lower IRR because the tax adjusted IRR is going to be much higher?
Right.
And so that's the math that we play with.
Yeah. And you mentioned, the renter and kind of building to the community. What are you talk about in your neighborhoods in the Cedars and North Oak Cliff? Like what's that? Who are your renters?
Sure. So infill Dallas, typically the renter is 20 to 35, 20 to 40 years old, and either single or a young couple. That's typically who we're renting to. And
do you find that the jobs and incomes you think, are they slightly Are they different from what we see in uptowns and downtown?
Yeah, so we have a lot of service workers. We have a lot of people, think paralegals, people working for DISD, people, we're in North Oak Cliff, people at Methodist Hospital, retail workers, things like that.
So you're giving them a good place to live at a cheaper rent than what they'd get to otherwise live near the urban center.
That's right. So our rents today are anywhere from $2 a foot on our kind of 1960s gut renovated property to $220 to $235 a foot for our new construction stuff. Whereas the true Class A competition that we have is closer to $240, $250 a foot.
Yeah. And I think it's a big deal too, because if you think about just us knowing this area, I think this is true all across the country as well, is oftentimes your choices are, the highest end of the market or stuff that's seen better days, right?
Yeah.
And so building more of that mid-level is important. We need more product like that.
Our amenity is our price. In many cases.
And having a decent, good place to live, right? I mean, it's not just cheaper; it's also still a quality, newer finish out, things like that.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk about. Let's move on to the policy side. You were just up on the Hill talking about extension and expansion of opportunity zones, and you and I were joking about this earlier, but there's not a lot of bipartisan issues these days. It is what it is, right? But it does feel like there's some bipartisan interests in expanding and extending opportunity zones. And so as you're talking to policymakers, what's your message been and how has it been received so far?
Sure. So the EIG data is wonderful, right? To show, because there's no mechanism for transparency, the EIG data allows us to walk into a House member, a senator's office and say, look, this OZ stuff has really worked.
Yeah.
We're creating housing and there's a housing crisis. That works. And so now you say, but the problem is OZ is about to expire. So you can only take investment into an opportunity zone fund until the end of 2026, and then it's over.
Yeah.
So we need to extend it. So that is kind of the first message that you give when talking to a legislator. The good news is in 2017, this legislation passed in a bipartisan, bicameral way.
Yep.
And we believe that it still has that ability. The issue on the Hill is that if it passes again, which we believe it will, the method for it to happen is in comprehensive tax legislation, which will happen this year, which is likely not going to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
It's going to be very partisan because there's a lot of other things that will be in comprehensive tax legislation that Democrats just simply will not vote for. So our message when speaking with Democrats was this opportunity zone legislation will be introduced in the House Ways and Means Committee and in the Senate Finance Committee as a standalone bill first. And so you have an opportunity to craft the initial OZ 2.0 legislation before it is folded in to the comprehensive tax bill. And we suggest that if it's something that you like, you not only help craft the bill, but then you also advocate for its inclusion in comprehensive tax legislation.
Yeah. And certainly, obviously there's some partisan elements to this, but certainly good to see the president has talked about opportunity zones. Obviously, Scott Turner, the new Secretary of HUD, opportunity zone advocate, and from his first role in the administration, for Trump's first administration. So, that gives it a lot of, muscle behind extending this.
Yes, and Scott Bessent at Treasury.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing it kind of throughout the administration. And then on the Hill, we're seeing Mike Kelly on Ways and Means really take a role there. Jason Smith, the chairman of Ways and Means, Mike Crapo, Tim Scott on the Senate side. So there are a lot of champions for Opportunity Zone.
Yeah, that's encouraging. So let's talk about OZ 2.0. And I want to start off just with our bread and butter, apartments, rental housing broadly. How can the current OZ program, obviously we need to extend it, but how can we also expand it to encourage even more apartment development in the next cycles?
Sure. Let's talk about like top 2 or 3 things. So first, if the only way to get any of the opportunity zone tax benefits right now is you must have had a capital gain in order to make an investment into the opportunity zone tax structure. It's never made sense to me. It's one of the biggest complaints we've had with investors, because the federal government set up this program to incentivize long-term patient investment in low-income areas. Well, why gatekeep that? You should allow anyone to invest in this tax structure if all you want to do is incentivize long-term patient investment in these census tracts. And it is getting bipartisan support to allow anyone, regardless of whether or not they've had a capital gain, to invest using the opportunity zone tax structure. And so if you have not had a capital gain, but you do have plenty of money in your checking account, you could invest in this tax structure, hold the asset for 10 years, and then not pay tax on the appreciation, not have to recapture the depreciation.
Yeah.
That will bring more money into the program.
So it's just real quick then. So you have to have either just had a capital gain event or be willing to sell something.
That's correct.
To get into that. That's got to be really limiting then for investors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else for apartment development specifically?
So that is a big one. The second one, we talked about, merchant building earlier and the requirement to hold 10 years. There is a mechanism to change that, and it's being called the OZ exchange, similar to the 1031 exchange.
Okay.
So if I wanted to change our business model and say, we're not going to hold for 10 years anymore, we're going to build and sell. We're going to build and sell. Well, I can now do that because I could build a deal, sell it, and then I would have 1 year from the time I sold it to find another opportunity zone piece of land in any OZ census tract throughout the country, build another opportunity zone project, and then sell it again. The only requirement would be that I continue doing that for 10 years. And then after the 10-year period is over, that last sale would be tax-free. So very interesting new idea, this OZ exchange.
Yeah.
I think it would create a lot more housing because you'd have experts like me, but also a lot of new entrants who would say, this is wonderful because it unlocks more of our capital to go create more housing.
Yeah, that's a great idea because I think a lot of merchant builders looked at this originally and were like, well, we can't really do this with our current investor structure.
That's right.
But this would, that'd be a game changer.
Yes.
All right. What about, unless there's anything else to talk about apartments, let's talk about other types of housing. Obviously, right now, for sale housing is a big issue. The current Opportunity Zone program does not really work for for sale housing. And we need more for sale housing too. So there's been some talk about expanding this to include home builders. How do you think that would work?
Exactly the way that I just mentioned with the OZ exchange. So you could take a production builder. They could buy a large, couple hundred acres of land. They could develop the streets, develop the paper lots, maybe even develop the houses and sell those to individual homeowners. And then they would have 1 year to recycle that money into another piece of opportunity zone land and go do that. Continue forward for 10 years. And then their last sale would be tax-free. So the same way that it would work for a merchant builder on the apartment side, it could work for a production builder on the single family home side. So really a huge unlock on the for sale housing side if that mechanism were to exist.
Yeah, that's another game changer. And let me ask you another question too. Do people ask about, are we tapped out in the current opportunity zone neighborhoods? Do we need to expand them? Do we need new ones? What are you finding in Dallas and other places you look at?
So we've always done something different. As I mentioned, we're kind of doing smaller urban infill stuff. And as of today, we have more projects than we do money. So no, I don't think we're tapped out. That being said, if OZ 2.0 were to happen, an extension and expansion, it would also send the legislation back to every state's governor, and every state's governor would have an opportunity to designate new opportunity zone census tracts in their states. So that would totally eliminate that argument, right?
Yeah.
Because there would be all new census tracts throughout the country.
That would be great. Well, Barrett, thanks so much for your time. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay.
And that'll wrap us up for episode 26. Thank you to Barrett for joining us. Thank you to all of you for spending part of your day with us. We'll see you next week.